Good afternoon, everyone. It's Trein. Happy to have you here in the Theories of Regulation seminar. And today I'm delighted to have Martino Maggetti and Philipp Trein present their work on policy integration and the politics of governing, especially complex problems. And thank you very much, Martino and Philipp, for making yourself available to present this work. I'll give the floor to you, but before I do that, I'll say a few words about yourself, but also I have one question to start for the kick-up. So Martino is Associate Professor of Political Science at the Institute of Political Studies at the University of Lausanne. Is scholar of regulatory governance, comparative public policy. Is the coordinator of the PI of Tigre, the project, the H2020 project on trust in governance and regulation in Europe. And is the editor of the Swiss Political Science Review. Very busy, and also a young father. So I envy you. I wish I could have, kids, small kids now. I have two older ones. And now Philipp is assistant professor of public administration and policy, also at the University of Lausanne. He's senior fellow at UC Berkeley. He was there for a long time, a year, right, Philipp?
Yes.
He covers policy integration, digitalization, health policy, crisis politics, and in 2019, he received the Ambizione grant from the Swiss National Science Foundation. So thank you very much. And before I give you the floor and allow you to put slides if you want, I'll ask you, why policy integration? How did you come to that? Not the rational thing, why it's important, but how did you two started to work on that? Why? How come? What make you aware of? What is the personal story about, beyond this topic? Can you share with us?
Yeah, Philipp, maybe. Thank you, by the way, very much for the invitation, David, to your prestigious web seminar series. Is really a pleasure. Well, we started a project a few years ago on the policy integration. Actually, when was that? At least 5 years ago.
2016.
So, yeah. So. Because we integrated our research interest, I guess. So we started working on policy integration as a practice of integrating our research interest, I guess. Well, that's the very simple answer, but
yes, I mean, I had just finished the PhD, and so first of all, I also like to thank you, David, for the invitation. Also happy to have the opportunity to present our work in the seminar. The work started at the time when Martino just got appointed here, and I had just finished my PhD. So we both were open to new research endeavors. Mm. And my previous work had been on the coordination of and integration of healthcare and public health policies. And Martino had obviously, as you know, worked a lot on regulatory governance, and thereby the theoretical merger of the two topics brought us to policy integration.
Excellent. I'll tell you why I'm interested and how did I become interested. Just in 2 sentences, I became interested in teaching around issues around the Dead Sea area. And the Dead Sea area includes ecological, industrial, touristic, regional, international cooperation, etc., water issue and energy issues, etc., etc. And so, this kind of policy integration is really an interesting, perspective to go into. And this is the context of my invitation. Now I'm shutting my you go, please.
Okay, I will share some slides with you. and then Martino will kick off the presentation. Can you see that?
Absolutely, excellent.
Yeah. So I will start, and then Philipp will take care of the real work, so to say. Okay. I can no longer see myself, but I think, or the audience, but I think it's normal, right? Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Philipp.
All right.
Okay. So yes, yeah. So we started working on this issue. Also, yeah, we actually became aware of the fact that this concept, that this term, was increasingly present both in the scientific literature but also in the policy practice. So it's something that we witnessed quite closely also from a Swiss perspective. So a lot of policy programs have been framed in terms of policy integration, whole of government, coordination, and so on and so forth. So it's truly, we had the feeling that it was something that a few years ago started becoming really central, and now we believe it is actually the case. Yeah, how do I move forward? Okay. Okay, excellent. So today we would like indeed to talk about the integration of public policies and of public sector organization. So in our view, as I anticipated a little bit, this is really a major transformation of governance, at least potentially. And it may also represent a new approach to policy making, whereby policy goals and policy instruments are no longer limited, so to say, to specific policy fields. So, you know, the classical silo division of labor, so to say, between, for instance, education policy, fiscal policy, healthcare, social policy, and blah, 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 blah. But policy goals and instruments are designed more and more in a way that they cut across several policy fields. And so our question, our motivation in a way is to try to discover why did government decide to engage in such reforms? So in reforms that aim in a way at recentering policy making at the national level. So as I also mentioned before, what we observe is that policy integration is becoming not only a key feature of contemporary governance, but also, of course, as a consequence, a major topic for public policy research. Here on the figure, you can see this remarkable increase in the number of scientific articles on policy integration over time, focusing either on the policy dimension or on the administrative dimension, so either on policy programs or on public sector organizations. Yeah, so I move forward because we have I guess some quite interesting results to show. So what is exactly at stake? So why is that interesting? The typical explanations for this trend towards more policy integration are usually framed in terms of the governance of problems. So policy integration is usually seen, considered, and also in a way, so to say, put forward by policymakers as a way to respond to increasingly complex problems, such as the climate crisis or the global pandemic more recently. It's because these problems are multidimensional, so and therefore the response to the problems should also touch on different dimensions, right? That's why we need, so that's the argument, an integrated response spanning across policy fields. Think about environmental policy. It needs to rely or it requires coordination on many policy fields like energy policy, transport, urban policy, housing, and so on and so forth. So another explanation for so the need for policy integration is about the need for creating more coherence given the progressive accumulation of policy programs over time, right? So there is an historical accumulation of different policy measures, and at the end, we need to recreate coherence through integration. So what we propose here is a complementary explanation, which refers to recentering through integration and coordination as a reaction to denationalization. So our goal is to identify the impact of denationalization on these reforms involving policy integration and administrative coordination. So if you want, our theoretical ambition is to reconcile under a unified analytical framework these two fundamental macro trends that are restructuring governance and also the role of the modern state in a way, denationalization on the one hand and recentering on the other hand. So I come back in a second on what we mean by denationalization. Let's start with the dependent variables, so with the phenomenon of interest. So we conceive and operationalize policy integration and administrative coordination in this way. So policy integration is the policy dimension, referring to policy goals and policy instruments of policy programs that cut across sectors, so what I've mentioned earlier. And then there is the organizational dimension, so administrative coordination, which is referring to the relationships between public sector organizations that evolves in the sense of more cooperation, more coordination among them. But there is also an institutional aspect. So, for instance, the creation of transversal units. And also the merging of department of ministry and ministries, right? As a way so a sort of extreme way to reinforce coordination among public sector organizations. So we are looking at this type of reforms. And the drivers in our model, so what we are arguing is that denationalization, in the sense of the delegation of political authority away from the nation state, upwards to international organizations, including the EU, downwards to the regional level, and sidewards to independent regulators, is actually creating a situation that is favoring recentering. So there is a sort of rebalancing from denationalization to recentering. And we have tried to specify the mechanism that now, I think the goal is not to be too theoretical here. We are not going into the details of the argument, but the underlying idea, so the overall idea is that this trend toward delegation and also the attribution of capacity to act to these actors creates a fragmentation of political authority and also a situation of over-specializations, policy silos, and also administrative actors that are over-specialized. And this situation creates pressures for more coordinated policy making at the national level. And this is why governments face strong incentives to re-coordinate, to recenter policy making through policy integration and administrative coordination reforms. So we have examined the impact of denationalization on this recentering with this research design that has been applied to 4 policy sectors, 13 countries over 34 years, so between 1980 to 2014. And well, Philipp will come back on the crucial aspect of the research design. And to conclude my introduction, so we selected these 4 policy fields because we wanted to explore diversity, especially in 2 dimensions. So the technical complexity of the policy problem at stake, and also the scope of integration. So whether integration occurs mainly within a specific policy fields that integrates instruments and goals from other fields, or whether it spans across several policy fields, colonizing, so to say, other policy fields. And yeah, now let's move to the real work, as I say.
Thank you very much, Martino, for the very thorough and clear introduction in the research. I will now try to explain the empirical part of our analysis, and therefore I'll go back to the slide before, and I just would like to say some things about what type of policy dynamics we were looking at. So for each of the 4 policy fields, we collected time series data, and we looked at the reform events that embody policy integration or administrative coordination in the 4 policy fields, and we selected specific types of policy changes. So for example, we looked at environmental policy integration reforms that really try to integrate the goal of environmental protection into different sectoral policies. Then we looked at migration policy, and we focused on the integration and coordination of instruments related to immigration, together with measures to integrate migrants into societies. In the field of employment policy, we look at the coordination of and integration of activation measures with cash benefits, so regulatory instruments, if you want to say, with measures that pay services to people. And in health policy, we look at the coordination and integration of preventative measures with healthcare services. And the table here again shows to you how these forms or these specific policy integration problems can differ across policy fields. So they can span across policy fields, but also they can policy integration within a wider policy field. So we have covered both dimensions here. And the data that we collected gives us a time series of reform events. And what you see on the graph here is that there is the reforms that entail policy integration and administrative coordination augment over time. And we call policy integration and administrative coordination reforms, we put them together as recentering of policy making, because it recenters the governmental action across policy subsystems and administrative organizations, as Martino said. And you see that this type of reforms augmented continuously across the 13 countries we look at. And you also see that they started to decline after the year 2000. So there is a wave of these reforms that follow as a sequence, as we will argue. They follow the delegation of authority away from the nation state. But before developing the empirical foundation of this explanation, we show you a bit more data that the type of reforms also differs between countries. And what you see here on the graph is the 2 types of policy changes we look at, and how they vary across the countries we have analyzed. And we see that the UK, the Netherlands, and Sweden, some more centralized states, above all, display much more such reforms than, for example, the US and Canada, which are much more decentralized. We can also infer from this graph that the type of administrative tradition could matter. For example, we see that in the one corner there's Austria and Germany with continental European administrative tradition that compares that is different from France and Italy, where the reforms are much more focusing on re-coordinating administrative departments. So this is part of the empirical story that is in our data, and that shows the variance of or patterns of policy integration in very different policy fields. And then we can also look at the differences between policy fields, and we see that the patterns vary between policy fields in some ways. So environmental policy integration is much more prominent in all countries, whereas in the field of health policy, the integration and coordination of prevention and cure is much less frequent in most countries, with the exception of Great Britain. So now we come back to the theoretical argument that Martino has presented, and we use the data to do some regression analysis, where we want to find out whether the delegation of competencies to regulatory agencies, subnational governments, and international organizations, jurisdictions, so the EU or other international organizations, if this makes such reforms more likely. And we conducted the models, we estimated the models that you see here on the slide, and the graph here shows you some of the results. So what we do see here is that the delegation of competencies towards the EU, so EU membership, augments the likelihood of policy integration and administrative coordination reform. And if we operationalize the EU, not only EU membership as a binary variable, but the actual capacity to act of the EU, so that's the pooling of authority with the EU according to the way it was measured by Hoge and Marx in the recent work. So the increasing autonomy of the EU overall augments the likelihood of such reforms, even if we control for time. On the other hand, we also see that the delegation of competencies to subnational governments, so decentralization, makes such reforms much less likely. Then the second result of the empirical analysis, and that is perhaps even more interesting for the community here, is that the delegation of competencies to agencies, and these are regulatory agencies first of all at the national level, make such reforms more likely. So David and his colleagues have collected a data set on the diffusion of regulatory agencies around the world, and we have used the data to develop a measurement of the extent to which regulatory agencies are present across a number of policy sectors. And the more agencies exist in a country, the more likely this type of reforms become. And these reforms become even higher if the likelihood of these reforms becomes even higher if we operationalize the potential independence of these agencies. And we also see that the delegation of competencies to EU agencies within the specific policy sector makes such reforms more likely. So it's the presence of a regulatory governance, regulatory agencies that augments the probability of these reforms. So to summarize the results from our analysis, we see above all that the delegation of capacities away from the nation state to task-specific organizations such as EU agencies and national agencies augments the probability of policy integration reforms. There's a less strong link with regard to general EU membership, whereas delegation of authority to subnational governments makes such policy change less likely. At the same time, we also see that the delegation of authority to international organizations that are task-specific, such as the World Health Organization, or the International Labour Organization, or the Global Environmental Forum or Fund, that does not have any effect. So what are the implications of this research for the literature? So first of all, we see, or we demonstrate in our main analysis, that the European Union and its agencies, as well as regulatory governance, has an important impact on the recentering of policy making. And this is important because it's in some ways it seems to be logical, but in some other ways it's a bit counterintuitive, because the creation of regulatory authorities is in itself somewhat the sectoralization of decision making. But it seems that governments react by trying to span across other pre-existing, by taking measures that span across other pre-existing silos and policy subsystems. Secondly, subnational governments seem to be an important veto point against such reforms. Not really left parties or party differences does not play such a strong role. We show neither the structure of government, but subnational governments seem to play an important role. And even more broadly, our research implies that the multi-level governance, understood as the unraveling of the central state, seems to actually challenge silo governance that has been present at the national level. And finally, the denationalization process, to conclude, triggers the recentering of public policy and administration at the national level. This was what I wanted to say. Martino, do you want to add anything to the comments?
No, thank you very much. I'm very curious about the questions, comments, and criticism. Just maybe a quick gloss is that we try to control for as many alternative explanations as possible in terms of institutional factors, political factors, bureaucratic factors, the nature of the problem. So our results, especially regarding the role of agencies, are very robust with respect to alternative explanation, problem pressure, the type of bureaucracy, whether it's politicized or not. Also, the ideological color of governments and so on and so forth. So, but yes, of course, we cannot control for everything in observational analysis.
Okay, so thank you all for listening, and we're looking forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Martino and Philipp. I'll start with the first question, and then we'll open up for a question from the others. So, and you can also comment and make questions in the chat. My own question, or the first one, and I'll start only with one, is you say EU and regulatory governance are important for policy coordination, policy integration, recentralization, and I couldn't see the link. I don't understand the implications. To what extent regulatory governance, which is so fragmented, is important for policy integration? So I'll start with that one and allow you to answer, and then we take more questions.
Yeah, so I think that the overall idea, then the specific mechanism can be, much more precise, but the overall idea is indeed that regulatory governance, as it creates fragmentation, ultimately also creates incentives for governments to try at home to reconstruct a sort of coherence of policy making through this type of reforms. So in a way, so broadly speaking, so the main mechanism, I believe, so we believe it's a reaction to this fragmentation. So it's in a way it's a dynamic view of multi-level interactions in a way, right? So there is a process towards the fragmentation of political authority that at certain point is producing a rebalancing movement by the government that try to recreate coherence in a way.
I see what you mean. So you say from government to governance, back to government to some extent.
Well, yeah, but it's obviously it's not back to square one, right? It's an evolution. So the delegation have been made and powers have been delegated away, and they are not in a way recalled back. Coherence is sought through by other means, in a way, right? Not by. So what we see is not that the independence of regulators is reduced as a consequence, but it's recreating coherence by other means against the background of delegations.
Yeah, I see what you mean, and I respect that. I invite you also to think about those kind of balancing acts also in the context of expansion of governance more generally. So it's not, while we don't have measure of GNP per capita to capture the growth of the economy, in governance we don't, but we do know that the governance capacity of states are increasing. And within this increased dynamic, the question is how you balance fragmented interests and the coherence of policy making. So the big governance perspective I'm pushing here. But let's take more questions. I see Tolga's end first. So Tolga, please come in.
Thank you, David. Philipp, I really did not say a proper hi to you. I feel bad. I just wanted to say hi again. This is astounding. I feel terrible that I haven't read the paper. Martino, we've never met, but I've read much of your work as somebody who's interested in central banking independence and also regulatory authorities and competition authority and regulatory governance and all that, formal, informal rules. One thing I wanted to ask was, do you see, I mean, it's a short question, and I have a longer question if we have time. Do you take PI as a constant or a variable? I didn't get it from the presentation. Does PI, or is it unidimensional, even if it is a variable? Is it one-dimensional? Or do we see patterns, different shapes, different natures of policy integration? I'm interested in policy integration for the past few years, and I'm trying to work on a project on child labor. How do we integrate policies? Not only goals, but as you said, instruments. So that's what I'm asking. Like do you see that is it a constant, meaning is it like a signium function? Does it exist? Does it not exist in your paper or in your research? Or even if it is a variable, what kind of a variable is this? I'm sorry.
I think we got it, Tolga. So please, please respond.
Okay, I can try to respond to this question. So hi Tolga, good to see you, and thank you for the question. The research we conducted, it is the data we eventually have. It's a binary events of reforms, and for us, policy integration, we measure it in two dimensions. One, what we call policy integration, which we call policy integration, which are basically the policy goals and instruments that are easy to integrate, or especially policy goals are easy to integrate. And the second part is about administrative coordination, and we call that coordination because it's very hard to integrate departments in a real way, because once created, powerful organizations resist, of course, change. So there is this. I think these are two dimensions that are crucial to policy integration. Because it's very easy to set up a new strategic plan that says let's do a lot against childhood poverty and put a lot of goals and concerned policy sectors in a government document, but to make that into a policy program that perhaps has funds attached to it is already more difficult. But then to get organizations on the ground to work together And to implement that is, I guess, the most difficult part. It's even more difficult because it requires implementation and evaluation strategies that stop turf defending and these kind of practices. So it depends also. I mean, you can see policy integration as a multidimensional concept, but then of course, if you want to operationalize it in a big comparative way, you'll have to scale down on the measurements. So it's a bit the answer to your question depends a bit on what on the way you want to look at it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to add something, Martino? Yes, or
no, I think it's well. Just that we also conducted some case studies where we were able, to try to identify a little bit the more fine-grained use of not I wouldn't say implementation, but adoption of policy integration reforms. Then we can really see also some. So you mentioned some interesting, more specific issues. So you mentioned, David, before the idea that policy integration may go with big government, but it's the case in some instances, but sometimes policy integration. Think about in the UK, what happened in the UK in some fields, like in migration policy. It could also be a way to cut budgets, right? You put different policies together, or different administrative structures together, and this is almost a zero-cost reform that could that it's less expensive than other more substantial reforms, and eventually it could also lead to budgetary cuts. So the uses of policy integration may actually vary quite a lot.
Yeah, this is an important point. I think I would say this might be the case. Alternatives that you hinted towards is that you cut budget but increase regulation and transfer costs to other actors. But it's an important point. Thank you very much. I see Sevastis. I don't go, Tolga. And Sevasti, I will bring you in a minute. But I want to go on the same issue. So,
I am actually going to ask about the same issue.
Okay, go on, please.
So, hi, nice to see you. Hi, Philipp.
Hi, Sevi, good to see you.
I was wondering, actually, this relationship between administrative integration and policy integration, because I have examples for example, from Denmark, where the government created administrative integration, merged two ministries. And actually this led to even more problems. It was dysfunctional. It increased competition between the units because they felt that they are losing their purpose and logic of portfolio, which led to less policy integration and decrease the number of policy instruments and decisions that would have happened. And then after some years, they decided to divide it. So I was wondering, if you take administrative integration and policy coordination at the same time, maybe this can be a little bit problematic, because administrative integration can lead or impede policy integration. Have you considered that?
Yes, of course. I mean, I think it's a very good point. I mean, we look at administrative coordination in our database. There are rather few examples of administrative integration, first of all. But I think, of course, this is something that can happen. And I mean, our researchers, we have not looked at the consequences of it. So we do not look at whether policy integration makes better policies. I mean, that's what we would like to think, or that's what a bit the normative assumption is, that if we shuffle the public sector, it might actually improve governance outputs. But this is not something that we have tested.
I was not talking about better policies. I was talking policy integration. Does it lead to more policy integration through instruments that deal with the problems for both?
Yeah, so as Philipp said, we are not really looking at policy implementation here, but we recognize what you are suggesting, and that's precisely why we have these two dimensions, right? So we consider the macro phenomenon of recentering through these two distinct dimensions. Policy integration, the policy dimension, and administrative coordination, the organizational dimension, precisely because we believe that they should be, they typically are associated, but they do not necessarily go together all the time, right? So we are, I think the analysis acknowledges for this potential mismatch between the two, and indeed in the descriptive analysis we can see that there are different trends of policy integration that is more frequent than administrative coordination, and in some countries policy integration, so the policy dimension precedes the administrative coordination. In other countries the reverse is true, so you see first the administrative reforms in a given sector leading to policy reforms. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you can really see that most reforms are organizational and not really policy related, which could be indeed a problem. Even though we don't make this diagnosis of a problem per se, but we show what's going on in the descriptive data.
Yes, the two variables are indeed correlated. We have not analyzed the sequence, and this would be actually something we could look at.
Yeah,
thank you.
This would be, it's an interesting question. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I would go back into that and urge you, or actually ask you if you know who really dig into the language and the conceptual aspects around integration, cooperation, long-term, short-term, and how you bring them all together into consideration, not only at the policy level, but also at the administrative level. I will also say, and to you all, that we have in the planning of the seminar lecture by Guy Peters on policy coordination, and Pearl Agred next week on the all government approach to that. So actually the conceptual map is very interesting for me. I was surprised that you were speaking about recentralization as a common bringing coordination and integration together, because I have an aversion to centralization and hierarchy. I know their value, but I kind of in my imagination they go to Erdogan or Bibi, and they are trying to curtail the professional, the independence of the regulatory agencies, etc. So a comment from me, or maybe you can recommend to us what to read.
Yes, we talk about recentering, not re-centralization. We're talking about recentering to the measures that span across, the governments try to span across policy subsystems and sectors, but not necessarily only in a power-seeking sense. So our data does not analyze necessarily political competition only, but policy making.
Yeah.
So it's through the instrument of policy seeking, which is in some ways embodies professional government, that we see that there is the aim to connect between silos actually. So it's not a part of the of a resistance against the state or the regulatory state, the protective state, the welfare state, in its multiple forms, but it's a consequence of the increasing specialization as such.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an horizontal trend, right? So what we are looking is not a vertical recentering, so to say, but is an horizontal dynamic
I see.
of developing policies and administration that span across sectors. They depart from the logic of policies silos. That's
I understand that.
So
are you aware of administrative units that try to do it across the government, across the administration, in a way that is beyond one reform or another? How is it organized into practice?
Sure, there are transversal units, for instance, in charge of sustainability, climate policies. They are created to try to establish connections between departments, for instance, in charge of applying the Agenda 2030 or whatever. These are transversal units that have a challenging missions, right? Try to interfere in the sectorial logics of policy sectors to create coherence and try to achieve some policy goals that are indeed.
And where are they located? Under which ministry or region, or where do you find them? What is are they ad hoc units, temporary units, or kind of long-term parts of the administration?
We have different examples, and our examples, they are mostly related to environmental protection and then sustainable governance.
Mm-hmm.
So it depends a bit on the problem you're attacking. You find a lot of these units when it comes to the environmental sphere. Now, with regard to unemployment policy, it's much less the case. That we didn't identify these coordinators, to put it that way, and also a bit less with health, I would say. So it depends on the problem, obviously.
Yeah.
But in the French case, for instance, there have been some quite intense administrative reforms implying the creation of new ministries, super ministries, pooling competencies in different fields. Important structural reforms, right? That's a bit the extreme case, right? When you merge ministries, create new ones that have this type of multidimensional tasks.
I see. One clarification question before I move to another question from the audience. Is there a OECD sustained work of the OECD, or a review paper that you can recommend on those issues? Which what is the best practices nowadays on policy integration? Are you aware of such a work? No.
Not in a general sense, no. I mean, the OECD certainly has governance reports about different problems. And I mean, you will always find in the environmental policy, sustainable governance literature, you will always find reference to the integration practice. But there is no general paper, at least not one that I'm aware of.
I see. Thank you very much. We have Sevi says there that the example she mentioned from Denmark was the merger of the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Agriculture in 2015. Interesting example. Thank you, Sevi. And there is this question from Ahmed. Ahmed, do you want to ask in person, or shall I read your question?
So the environment I'm in is a little bit noisy, so if you could ask it, I will be glad.
Okay, so Ahmed, I hope I pronounce your name correctly. And he asked what role policymakers as individual can have in terms of integration. Why would UK have more integration For example, is the centralization itself the only explanatory factor? And does centralization cause more integration by limiting salience of politics beyond the integration? And you have it in the chat, so you can follow. Who wants to start?
Maybe there are two questions at least. It's very interesting. No, but political leadership as a role, right? So we saw it early on with the Blair government in the UK. Was a very prominent supporter, even initiator, maybe of this approach, right? So it's also a question of political leadership, of course. So then, obviously, actors act within institutions. They play political games and so on and so forth. So disentangling the individual role of actors from the way they act within a specific context is not so easy. But I think that looking at so there is also an impact of party politics, of course. So maybe you want to comment, especially on the second question, which I forgot in the meanwhile. But
yes, thank you for the question. So I agree with Martino that the UK it's an outlier, and the reasons for why we see that is certainly, on the one hand, that the government has a certain power or a capacity to act. And to propose programs that cut across different policy sectors. The other question was about individual actors, and I mean it's an open question, research question. Is the role of policy entrepreneurs or individuals who might combine different sectoral policies. So take, for example, the reform trying to merge the environmental protection department and the agricultural department that Sevi has brought up. So something that we see from other research that goes beyond ours now, that is coming up soon, is that there is an important role for entrepreneurs who would actually facilitate or manage such types of reforms, and who need to broker the compromise that is necessary to either merge the departments or to create patterns or to practices of coordinations that then would lead to policy integration. So there is a key role for such actors, and this is something that is an open research question. So in a way, the actor foundation of the policy integration literature is still a bit underdeveloped, and so this is one way that needs to be explored. But I absolutely agree that the role of individual politicians is very important.
Thank you. Thank you, Philip. One more question from me, and then I will allow Tolga also to ask. And there is also a question from Emina. Would you say that one advantage of policy coordination and policy integration is that it allows more planning in the sense of long-term view, because you have to discuss, you have to coordinate, this is an opening, the windows of opportunities, I mean, to take the long-term into the policy process more than in the past, yeah? Because you have to reason, and when you have to reason, you have to look up. And when you look up, you think, and I see your face, you say so, you say yes, I think, and I would also say, just I promise, last sentence, that we public policy and governance and regulation deals less with planning than we should do. We should also return to the planning paradigm, planning issues, and put the long term into government and governance literature and in practice for sure. because planning is outcast in the literature, not only integration, also planning. So your response, and then Emma, Tolga, and we close.
No, quickly, I think you're right, David, in the sense that you need a quite explicit policy design for policy integration reform. So you have to think explicitly, try to how to manage the complexity of policy problems. But what we have also observed is that this implies a perspective on the long term, but sometimes it also works. So it needs to be put into place on the very short term. That's what we observed in the context of the policy responses to the COVID crisis, right? There was a policy integration in the sense that policymakers needed to coordinate the economic side of the policy response, the health side of the policy response, restrictions, and so on and so forth, in a way that was, immediate, almost immediate. Yes. So there was no time to really think through about the policy design in a very long-term way. There was an acceleration of the dynamics at work, right?
Yeah, thank you very much. So Emina, Tolga, and then you conclude. Emina, please.
Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for the wonderful presentation. My name is Emina. I'm a PhD candidate, and I also work on policy integration, on how policies of decent work are streamlined into the system. So what I was wondering was, what do you think the effect of different systems of government is? Intuitively, like reading about policy integration, I think that more unitary states should be able to, integrate policies more easily compared to federal states. But then on the other hand, there's this other kind of thinking which tells us that federal states have to have a certain degree of coordination already in place, like mechanisms of coordination that were built afterwards in order to do anything. So what are your thoughts? What does your data say? I was wondering. Did you notice any variance between unitary and federal states? Thank you.
Okay, so please answer first and then Tolga, please.
Thanks for the question. Very great question. So our data clearly shows that decentralization or federal states conduct less reforms, change less the link between sectoral policies. So there's less policy integration and administrative coordination reforms, and that makes sense because there is some policy competencies are at the subnational level, so the national government cannot reshuffle them all around, or only by means of long negotiation, and
at the national level.
At the national level.
So there might be reforms in this direction at the subnational level, but this is
not included in our analysis. So if you want to compare this federal state and unitary states, you'll have to also look at what is happening at the subnational level if you want to get the full picture.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you will see less reforms at the national level.
Wonderful. Like the reason why I asked you was because there were in the literature we have a few studies that show that federal states have the advantage of being able to test policy integration at subnational level and then kind of more easily take them to state level. So I thought that this could also be like a facilitating circumstance, but yeah, it seems that it's not. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. And last, again, Tolga, please.
David, Kerem had his hand up. I wonder whether he still has a question.
I didn't see him.
Kerem, would you like to take the floor?
Thanks a lot. No. I'm thanks a lot for. I also received my the answers. Yeah, thanks a lot, Philipp and Martino. And yeah, warm regards and thanks very much for this thought-provoking presentation.
I feel terrible that we're taking time.
Yeah, sure. Quickly. Yeah, but yeah, they also need to catch up with the roundtable.
Kerem, did you want to ask a question or?
No. Thanks.
Okay. No.
I'm done.
So please, shortly, Tolga.
Do you see any difference, variation between EFTA and EU member states overall? Like, I'm sure you guys looked at Switzerland, for example. Do you see any clear variation in terms of EU, France, EU, Switzerland? You do?
Yes, I mean, between EU and non-EU member states, yes. In non-EU member states, including Switzerland, but also including Anglo-Saxon countries, not the UK.
You can see that.
So the answer is yes.
Yes.
Good answer.
Okay, so thank you very much all. Thank you very much, Martino. Thank you very much, Philipp. Excellent presentation on very promising research agenda. So we are grateful for you and hope to have you all in the series again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much to
us.
everyone.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice day.